Welcome everybody to Wednesday Connect. My name is Nancy Walters. I'm the Executive Director of the La Jolla Community Center. Wednesday Connect is a informal, casual, social program that we've come up with. It started in June. It's just a great way to introduce interesting topics and to socialize and get to see each other on a weekly basis. Stefano Poggi was born in Rome, Italy, to an American mother and an Italian father, and grew up between Rome and San Diego. After finishing his degree in psychology at the University of California, San Diego, Stefano sought for a way to connect his Italian heritage to his life in the United States and found that Italian wine was the perfect bridge. He loves to share the stories of winemaking families in Italy throughout the Americas. Stefano is a certified specialist of wine and with the Society of Wine Educators and a distinguished Italian wine specialist with the North American Sommelier Association. Please help me welcome Stefano Poggi and take it away.
Grazie, grazie. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for your fun answers on wine. Sounds like there's a nice, fun range about people that are unfamiliar with Italian wines and want to learn more, and some people that drink it pretty frequently. So it's an exciting mix. And so the presentation is kind of based on that idea that to increase everybody's knowledge on the baseline and also explain things from a slightly different perspective about Italian wines. I've been educating with Italian wines for the last 15 years, and I find that wine education can be some of the driest and dullest out there unless you make it more engaging. And I think one of the best ways to do it is to kind of explain the why certain things is. Because we could spend easily half an hour or several hours going through technical information about each wine and what makes them different in Italy, but it just becomes a rote memory exercise. So sometimes learning the why behind things makes it easier to understand and appreciate and maybe be more exciting. So that's my hope. So with that in mind, I redid the presentation that I've been using to start with since I had some free time in 2020. So this is a new presentation that I want to invite you all to. So this is an introduction to Italian wine, and I'm going to be making some central premises, some central arguments. And one is that Italy is the #1 wine in the world, or the region for the wines in the world. And how can I make such a claim? Well, I'm going to talk about that today. And also, how much do you really need to know about Italian wines? And the short answer, the spoiler, is that you really can know as little or as much as you want about Italian wines. The benefit of Italy is there's always more to learn if you want to. So if you enjoy the Prosecco or the Pinot Grigio or the Rosato di Scalabrone that you're enjoying, and that's all you want to know, that's great. That's all you need to know. But if you're excited about that wine and want to know why you like it so much, the opportunity to do so is very rich in Italy. So when I say Italy's the #1 country in the world for wine, it's because of a couple different things. And the most important is because Italy has the most grapes of anywhere. And I'll go into detail in all of these. This is kind of the table of contents for today. Italy also has the most wines, has the biggest production on many scales. It's the biggest import for us here in the United States. So it's very important to the United States. And I think hopefully everybody in the room will agree that if you've tried some Italian wines, Italy makes some of the best and most unique wines in the world. I'm not going to say it makes the best wine in the world, because I'm obviously a little biased on that, but hopefully you'll agree that Italy makes some good quality wines and some that are pretty memorable. So the basis for the discussion today is when we talk about it, if you didn't know before these basic facts about Italy, that we have the most grapes, the most wines, oftentimes when people encounter this information is they just throw up their hands like Edward Monk's The Scream over here and just say, this is way too complicated. Why do I even bother learning about Italian wines? And I was trying to find an image that really represented that to me. And I found this jigsaw puzzle made in Italy. How appropriate. And that's, I think, the not correct way to think about Italian wines. For me, it's more about complexity, not complicated. So on the other image, you'll see, if you're not familiar, it's a type of broccoli. It's a Romanesco broccoli. And it's one of nature's fractals. So fractals are repeating patterns the more you go in. So if you were to stare into the image of this vegetable, the more you go into the vegetable, you'll see that more and more patterns emerge. And so there's an order to things. And Italian wines are fairly similar to that. There is a reason behind things. There's a why. So that's the main thing. Not the what today, but the why. So let's start off with a central fact that I repeated before, but I'll say it again. Italy has the most native grapes in the world. So if we were looking at the entire world, all the wines that are made commercially, not in somebody's backyard, but commercially that are sold and made into distinct wines, there's currently 1,368 vine varieties out there. That's every single wine that we know of. Italy has 377. Now that is a low estimate. Some people say 500, some people say 1,000 or thousands of different native grapes of Italy. To put that in perspective, that is 28% of the world's native grapes. It's the exact same number, pretty close, as to France, Spain, and Greece all together. One small country, Italy, has the same amount of grapes as 3 major wine-producing countries. And if you're not familiar with the term native, the synonyms would be autochthonous or indigenous. And the idea is these are grapes that don't just resemble other grapes, but these are unique, specific, exclusive, and original to this country. So Italy has 377 grapes or more that we know genetically started in Italy. And the idea of even just knowing grapes is actually room for future discussion, because it's actually fairly difficult, unless you're a professional, to understand different grapes and tell them apart. Back before genetic research, you based everything on ampelography, which is looking at the grape, looking at the leaves, looking at the clusters of berries of grapes on the vine, which helps you distinguish different grapes from others. And then now we can do genetic research and really parse them apart, and we start to learn what the different grapes and then clones of those grapes are. So there's a lot of different grapes out there, but Italy has so many. The important question again is why? Why does Italy have so many different grapes? Nope. There we go. Some other things that might be interesting to know is that Italy's the #1 as far as production in many different things. So if you look at just wines, Italy has 75 DOCG wines, 333 DOC wines, 118 IGT wines, and then many other Vino di Tavola. And if you're not familiar with those terms, we're actually going to get into that. That's kind of some important things to know about Italian wines. But suffice it to say that Italy has 500 or more distinct wines. Now, if you're going to try to do the exercise of thinking of how many wines you know from California, sure, you can talk about Napa Cabernet, which are great. You can talk about Pinot Noir from Sonoma, and you can go on for a while, but you're not going to get anywhere close to 500 unique, distinct wines from the United States. Italy is the only one that can boast these kinds of numbers, even just in terms of production. So as far as acreage in the world, a lot of people think about Spain and France and Italy, which is true. Those are 3 of the biggest producers of grapes. A lot of people don't know China is actually the biggest or #2 country in the world for grapes. Most of it's for table grapes, but China actually had some of the oldest wine production in the world, potentially the oldest. And now the ramping up of wine from China is really incredible. But Italy is still very much a contender. In fact, most of the grapes that Italy makes are for winemaking, which makes Italy the #1 as far as wine production. It's because Spain moves their grapes around. Sometimes the grapes go to France and other countries. The French use a lot of grapes to make spirits. And China, like we talked about, uses it to make table grapes. So Italy, a lot of the production of the grapes are for wine because it's so essential to Italy. Also by exports, Italy is the #1 exporting country for wine in the world. As far as imports to the United States, almost always in the last 30 years, 25 or more of those years, Italy was the #1 country by volume of import to the United States. So not only is Italy important on a world basis, but here in the US, Italian wine is very important as well. And like I said, I think that hopefully everybody in the room can agree that some of the best, if not all the best, but some of the best and most unique wines in the world are made in Italy. In fact, if you were to look at the Wine Spectator's top 100 list, if you were to interview a somm and ask them, what was your aha moment? What is it that got you into wine? Or if you look at any other metric, most often people will talk about Italian wines, along with beautiful wines from around the world, but Italy gets mentioned quite a bit. So hopefully I've at least made the argument that Italian wines are fairly important in the world. And then I'm going to stop at a couple points during the presentation. I was alerted that maybe there's a little bit of an internet blip on my end, so sometimes you may not hear me. So I'll try to take some pauses, and I'll do that shortly. Before I do, I wanted to kind of put things in perspective a little bit. So one of the things being a Californian Italian is how similar the two countries or two areas are. So I just want to throw some numbers out there. Italy is 115,000 square miles compared to the bigger California, which is 164,000 square miles. Population's a bit bigger in Italy, though declining. We're at 60 million people in Italy compared to 40 million in California. But when you look at wine, you see the stark difference. Even though California is bigger, the vineyard area in Italy is twice the size as in California. When you look at wine production, again, it's twice the size as California. And part of the reason may be the drinking. Wine is essential to Italian life. In fact, the average Italian drinks 45 bottles a year. I don't know many Italians that drink that few bottles, but there are Italians that counteract the other ones like myself that do enjoy wine a little bit more frequently. But if you compare that to, say, Californians, Californians on average drink one split. They don't even drink one full bottle of wine a year. So just to put in perspective how small Italy is, and yet it's such a powerhouse in the world stage for wine. So before I go into the why, I just want to take a pause. There is the option to write me questions on the chat there if you're familiar with Zoom, or if anybody needs to stop me. I know that you're muted, but I believe Nancy can help with that as well. But unless there's any questions immediately, I'm not seeing any on my screen, then I'll keep going.
Stefano, I just wanted to let everybody know before we get too far into the presentation that we are planning a wine tasting, a virtual wine tasting coming up. And we don't have the exact details quite yet, but as soon as we do, we'll go ahead and email them to you so that you can have the date, the time, the wines that you'll be tasting, and a lot more details. So if you have any more information on that, Stefano, that you want to add right now, please feel free, but everybody will get information in their email as soon as we have everything completed.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll go into that towards the end. Just see if everybody is interested and still listening at that point. But thank you for mentioning that. And there's a good question here about native grapes in the U.S. And there are native grapes in the U.S., quite a few. Most of them are not actually well suited for wine production, mostly because the origin of grapes in the United States is actually a completely different genetic rootstock, which actually saved the world of wine later on, but that gets a bit lengthy in the tooth. So I'll address that probably at the end, Glenn, if that's okay. But yeah, the U.S. does have the Americas do have some native grapes as well, but not quite the diversity as the United States, as Italy and a lot of the old world, mostly because of evolutionary spread. But excellent question, but I'll address that a little bit later, fuller. So unless there's any other questions, we'll talk about why is it that Italy has so many native grapes? And to me, that's kind of the crux of Italy. You can talk, yes, exactly, Concord is a native US grape. Nice job, Glenn. So why is it that Italy has so many different grapes? And that's kind of be the most part of this talk. Because for some people, like I said, the fact that Italy has so much sometimes can be a little overwhelming. But to me, the other side is that the opportunity to play around and encounter new and exciting wines is so much richer in Italy than anywhere else. And the bounty that we have to offer in Italy is what exactly makes Italy so exciting. So there's a couple different reasons that Italy has so many different wines. History, geology, climate, and culture are some of those reasons. So let's talk about history for the region. And when I've been doing this, I've noticed that, actually, let me go back a second. So you'll notice that here on the top of the title, I had the chat open, so I was missing it. Italy has the most native grapes, but that's not all. So if you look at some of the other things in Italy that everybody hopefully is fairly familiar with, on every scale, Italy has a biodiversity that is hard to match anywhere in the world. When you think about cheeses, hopefully everybody here has a favorite Italian cheese, whether it be gorgonzola or taleggio or mozzarella or pecorino or the king, Parmigiano Reggiano. There's so many unique cheeses to different parts of Italy that are actually protected and special and unique to these parts of Italy. Same thing with fruits. If you talk about some of the best citrus in the world, you always include Sicily in that conversation. When you talk about lots of different types and subtypes of apples, you always talk about Trentino Alto Adige in northern Italy. When you talk about vegetables, you talk about Radicchio Trevisano. We're actually in San Diego, we had the king of Radicchio until he sold it, but he's also a great winemaking guy. You talk about nuts, you talk about hazelnuts from Piemonte being some of the best, if not the best hazelnuts in the world, or the pine nuts from the Mediterranean coast to make pesto, sorry, or the pistachios from Sicily, from Bronte. And hopefully everybody here knows that there's so many different types of pasta. And so is it a bad thing that there's so many different types of pasta? There's spaghetti, there's fettuccine, there's lasagna, there's gnocchi, there's orecchiette. And each one has its own function. So if you go to an Italian restaurant that lets you intermix the sauces and the pastas, you lose some of the point of those different pastas developing in different parts of Italy. So for example, spaghetti with meatballs does not exist in Italy. For one, you could have a spaghetti bolognese with a meat sauce, but you would never use spaghetti because it's a round shape and it doesn't do a good job of collecting all that sauce. So you want something flat like a fettuccine or a linguine to do ragu, which is why in the Parma and Emilia, in the Bologna area, they use that type of pasta. Same thing with meats. There's so many different cold cuts and different things. In fact, talking about animals, Italy has 1/3 of all of the fauna of Europe and a lot of the flora as well. So Italy isn't just the grapes that has so much. Italy has a lot of everything. But why is that? So historically, specifically about grapes, but it applies to everything, we know that there has been grape for wine production in Italy going back at least 7,000 years. So we have remains of grapes for wine production that have been found in Sicily in some of the caves that have been carbon dated to going back that far. There's very few countries in the world that can claim playing around with grapes for wine production that far back. Some other notable periods in the history of wine in Italy is that the Greeks, when they discovered Italy in 800 BC, they were so amazed by how many grapevines, how many grapes there were in Italy that they called it Onotria, which means the land of vines. So it's very important, and the Greeks recognized that as well. Another important blip is sacramental wine. In the Middle Ages, Italy being the cradle of Catholicism, wine for the service was very important. And if that doesn't sound like it was a big deal to you, then you have to remember here in California, we wouldn't be as far along with wine production in California if it weren't for a couple of wineries in California being allowed to continue during Prohibition, where everything else was shut down. A couple of wineries were able to maintain that wine knowledge and that expertise and keep it fresh for when Prohibition was finally repealed. Another, and probably the most important date, is 1861. So a lot of people think about Italy as this ancient country, where in reality, it's actually younger than the United States. So you'll see here on this map, these different regions. So these were the different regions before Italy was unified in 1861 into a monarchy. But before then, it was city-states. You think about the city-state of Pisa, of Venice, of Milano, of Firenze, all these strong individual localized powers that had their own militaries, their own language and dialect, their own money, their own local food customs and wine customs. And so you start to realize that Italy is this combination of different countries, which is part of the reason that it has so many different things, because everybody's contributing to this general pot that became Italy in 1861. Another important date to remember when we go into it is this DOC, DOCG stuff that some of you may know and some of you may not. And that happened pretty late in the 1960s and 1980s. So those are kind of these important dates to think about for Italian wines. The length of scale that Italy's been making wine, and how as a country, as one unified offering of wine to the world, Italy's fairly young. Another, for the science-minded folks out there, geology is really important in Italy. And Italy can boast some of the most complex, if not the most complex, geology in the world. We have vineyards that are active on geological strata that go back 20 million years or more. We also have Italians that grow grapes on active volcanoes, so some of the youngest soil in the world. You know, in some parts of the world, they have the small issue of pests or mold or mildew. Some Italians have problems with lava. So everybody's got their battles. And obviously the people that are making wines on Etna and Vesuvius think it's worthwhile to keep making great wines on active volcanoes because they're so unique and different. And this is large scale. I mean, Italy has this unique feature where it's actually part of the Ring of Fire, very active volcanoes like we talked about, ancient volcanoes. In fact, there's different mountain ranges throughout Italy. There's actually an inland sea for millions of years. So the geology in a macro scale is quite different. But even if you zoom in, so somebody mentioned Nebbiolo being one of their favorite wines, and we'll talk about that some more. The area of Barolo, some of the vineyards are so different that hilltop to hilltop, you can find fairly different geology, which makes completely different wine, Barolo in this case. So Italy has some of the oldest and some of the youngest soil out there, and a lot of interspersion of the different soil types, which keeps things very interesting. I'm hoping that some people have had the chance to travel to Italy, and hopefully we'll get to go to Italy soon. But you'll of course noticed or probably know that Italy's climate changes quite a bit. Even though it's a small country, smaller than California, in the north it's fairly cool, in the south it's fairly warm. And also we've got these massive mountain ranges. On the top of Italy, you got the Alpi, the Alps, with the tallest mountain, Monte Bianco or Mont Blanc, depending on where you think the peak is located, the tallest mountain in Europe. But also down the middle of Italy, you have this mountain range, the Apennine. So you can get an incredibly different climate and elevation in just a few hours. Just think about the fact that if you were to, anywhere in Italy is about 4 hours from the ocean. Think about that compared to the United States, how it could take days to get to the ocean. Whereas in Italy, you can zip over in 4 hours, go from side to side, up and down the mountains. And the mountains are just so key to everything in Italy. In fact, because of the mountains, because of the unique shape of Italy and where it's located, a lot of people postulate that that's the primary reason that the winds that affect Italy is the major reason we have this biodiversity in Italy, whether it's the spread of pollen or seeds or humans, because Italy's been invaded and been part of the world economic spectrum from different parts of the Mediterranean and Northern Africa and Asia for millennia. So there's all this meeting ground that happens in Italy. So those are some of the reasons, just some of the reasons that Italy has this incredible biodiversity. So hopefully at this point during the talk of me talking, we'll have hopefully agree that Italy has a lot to offer, and we kind of understand the why that Italy has. So hopefully there is, again, another why. Is it really make sense to showcase all these different wines instead of just picking and choosing maybe the top 10 or the top 20 like we do in other countries? Well, the fun thing about Italy, like we talked about, is that wine is made everywhere, and that makes a big impact on the wine. Italians make wines in the high hills and mountains. So on the left side there's a picture of Barolo, the high hills of Barolo in Piemonte, where you can see the Alps in the background. And this is small potatoes compared to some parts of Italy. Up in the northern parts of Italy and in Liguria, some people harvest their grapes by helicopter, or essentially by bungee cord, because the hills and the mountains are so steep where they're trying to do wines. If you look in the top right corner, that's a picture from Puglia, where people are planting grapes in a sandy soil with underneath a much, much older soil. So you can plant it in the mountains, you can plant it in the plains, or in the hills. In the bottom right there, you'll see a picture of Chianti. So the hills with the typical Galestra soils of Chianti. So many different options of soil and climate and history all lend themselves to very unique specific wines. And it then makes sense in saying like, okay, maybe we should allow this other wine, we should think about this other wine because they're so different. It's not the similarity, you can easily tell the difference. Even if you're a novice in Italian wines, if you were to drink a red wine from Northern Italy compared to Southern Italy, a wine grown on the mountains compared to the plains, so many things add to the wine and you can even tell the difference. And the more you learn about wine, the more you can appreciate those differences. And that's the point, to be able to appreciate. And of course, culture. In Italy, we love food. Hopefully you love our food as well. But there's so many different local foods. And part of that is because so many wines were inspired by local foods. And the flip side, so many foods were inspired by local wines. And so there's this profusion between food and wine that kept growing and growing and growing. And it explains also why there's so many different foods in Italy. So Italy is definitely the country of bounty as far as how many different things Italy has to offer. If you're unfamiliar, those are white truffles that I did for a white truffle and Barolo event a couple of years back. Not bad dining experience, I hope, for everybody. So I'm gonna take another break here. I saw some other great questions that I'll address a little bit later. But if anybody has anything topical, or if my internet skipped and you missed anything, let me know. Otherwise, that kind of covers the why Italy is important and why Italy has so much and why it's important that Italy has so much. And now we'll kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how to understand Italian wines. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm gonna keep going. So obviously, with so many different Italian wines, we needed a system to understand, to bring some order to all these different wines that we have. And so the Italians in 1960, after many years of debate, decided to follow the French protocols. So thank you, France, with the AOC system, which is a system based on where are certain things from, and is it important that they're from those places? And the answer, as you can probably tell, is that for these wines, the 500 wines that we talked about, it is important what is used and where it's used. So it's not necessarily just the grape or where it's done, but this very important combination. And one of the best ways I've heard of understanding this is that, a lot of times we focus on just the grape or just the region is a CD player. So what makes the music? Is it the CD or the CD player? Well, obviously a combination of both. And so if you have a better quality CD, it's going to make better music. But if it's not a great CD player, it's going to sound scratchy. Same thing, you need both where it's from and what it's made from to make sense of it all. So just to quickly go through this, for those of you that already know, for those of you that don't, if you want me to spend some more time on it, we can definitely do it later. But there's basically 4 levels to Italian wines. And this is not, please know at the outset, this is not price-wise oriented. So in France, when we talk about first gross, a lot of that was because of commercial, where there was a consensus that you're willing to spend more money for first gross than other wines. And that's kind of how the classification of Bordeaux happened, for example. In Italy, it's much more the whole French AOC system of where everything is from. And the higher you go up in this ladder is not necessarily the more money that you necessarily have to spend, but the more protected these wines are because of place and style. So at the bottom, you have vino di tavola, table wine. How much can you expect to know from a wine that's labeled as table wine? You hope it's Italian. You hope it's Italian, and they give you maybe a grape and maybe a vintage on there. It's meant to be the catch-all of all Italian wines. This became an issue in the 1980s when a very famous Italian gentleman, you may have heard of him, Roberto Parker. I don't know if you've heard of him before, but he came to Italy in the 1970s and found some wines that didn't make sense in the rigid system, the DOCG system. And some of you may know that those wines were super Tuscans, some of the most expensive wines of Italy. In fact, the most expensive wine of Italy is usually either Massetto, which is a Merlot super Tuscan from Tuscany, or Monfortino, a Barolo. So it doesn't necessarily matter where it is on the scale, the price of the wine, but just the more you can find out about the wines. So that's indicazione geografica tipica, is this level that was created in the 1980s, and that just means it's typical of a certain area. The last 2 levels are really the focus for the Italian system. Di origine controllata, so the origin of the grapes are controlled, and you have to follow certain rules. Or at the tippy top of the system, there's the 75, just the 75 DOCG wines, di origine controllata e garantita. So not only is the origin of the grapes, one or a mix, the recipe for the wine controlled, but also it's guaranteed. And the guaranteed is that there's the guarantee that winemakers are following lots and lots of different rules to make that wine. So to use Barolo as an example, what the government requires you to follow is the type of grape, 100% Nebbiolo in this case, the types of clones, subtypes of grapes that you're using, exactly where the grapes are coming from. It's a 4,400 acre area. The direction the vineyards face has to face south, it can be east or west, but south oriented. The altitude of the vineyards, the soil type of the vineyard, the age of the vines, the density of the vines, the fact that it's not irrigated and done by hand, the minimum alcohol, the minimum amount of aging, which is 3 years of Barolo, and on and on and on. And the idea is not to make it so rigid that it doesn't allow flexibility. It's the idea that if you're going to label a wine, say Barolo or Chianti, that as a consumer, you know certain things have happened. And so once you try one example of a Barolo or a Chianti, then you can go to another producer and have a confidence of knowing what the wine is like and seeing what their twist on the wine is like. It's like doing poetry with a standard system of rhyming and syllables. You can do amazing poetry, like say haiku, with very standardized rules, and you can express a lot of beauty, and you can really love that system. Or you can do freeform, something like an IGT, and make some beautiful wines as well. As a producer, those are your options. And then the European Union decided to make things even more fun and then just overlaid a system for all food, including wine, which is the IGP and DOP system. So if you see this on a bottle of wine, IGP is exactly the same as IGT, they're equivalent. And then DOP is equivalent to both DOC and DOCG. Now, in reality, pretty much everybody that gets a DOCG wine is not going to put DOP on the label. If it's a DOC wine, you know, sometimes they'll put DOP or sometimes they'll put DOC. But that's just another extra wrinkle, unfortunately, to have to know. But the idea, once again, is to protect, because Parmigiano Reggiano comes from Parma, because of the grass that grows there, because of the rivers that are there, and the cows, the type of cows that are there eating the cheese, and the way they make Parmigiano is standardized because it has to be adherent to the system, because they've decided that that's the best, and they put that up as an example, and you can't make that cheese anywhere else. So Parmesan is most definitively not Parmigiano Reggiano. It's unique. So the same thing for wines. So if you have some questions about that, we can go over it later, but that's kind of the main things to know about the Italian system. And you'll know the difference because on a DOCG wine, it'll say DOCG, that'll be a little sticker. It'll be white sticker with some gold trim, and DOC wines will be white with some blue trim, but it'll be largely stated DOC and DOCG. Another thing to know is that DOCG wines are usually named after the village that's central to that production. So there actually is a town called Barolo, which is why the wine is called Barolo, because that's where it's from. So just to give you an idea, if you really want to jump into Italian wines, this is the worst region. This is the most standardized, the most restrictive region of Italy. It's Piemonte. It has by far the most DOCGs of the 75. Piemonte has 17 of the DOCGs of Italy, and those are the red boxes that sometimes are actually 2 DOCGs, and the black boxes are DOCs. And you don't have to know this. This is just to kind of give you an idea of where Italian wines are made and how everybody is so proud, orgoglioso, of the wines from their specific area, and the recipe and the way they make them are protected, that they can only come from this area. Once again, you don't have to know all this, but this is to give you an idea that there is some order behind the chaos that often is what Italy looks like, whether it's politics or soccer or wines. There is usually a reason, usually, hopefully. So that's a good example of that. Other good words to know, I get these questions a lot. So these are just a little vocabulary. If you ever see a word superiore on a wine, that means more alcohol. That's it. You know, we think about California, it being warm, it's easy to do grapes and to get to that level of sugar so that you can get to that phenolic ripeness and that amount of alcohol you want. But in some parts of Italy, it's fairly cool. So to be able to get to a minimum level of alcohol is quite difficult. So superiore was introduced just to show you that it's gone above and beyond the minimum alcohol requirements. There's more to it, but that's the basic. There's also classico, is really important to know. Classico is the historical center of production. So a great example is Chianti Classico. So the idea, the concept of Chianti started in this one little area, the Chianti Classico area now, and then spread out. And other wines follow this suit as well. So Classico is basically the heartland. Is it always the best subzone? No, but oftentimes it is, because that's where it has the most history and the most knowledge and time. Riserva is another good one to know. It just means it's aged longer. So oftentimes 1 year, but it can vary, but it just means more. So if you like a wine that's more intense, that's smoother, you'll probably tend to like Riserva wines above the regular wines. Other good words to know refer to the sparkling quality of the wines. If you ever see frizzante on a wine, that means fizzy. It has a little bit of bubble. A good example for this is Moscato di Asti. It's a single fermentation in a closed tank, and all the CO2 byproduct of making the wine is contained in the wine itself, and so it has this little refreshing bubble or fizz to it. Compared to, say, spumante, which is a technical term which means sparkling, so it has at least 3.5 atmospheres of pressure. So now you're talking about a mushroom cap and a cage and a thicker bottle. So those are some things to know. The last one that I would say is good to know is passito, is a good term to know. That just means dried. So oftentimes for dessert wines, the way that Italian wines up that sugar level to then have residual sugar to make the wine sweet is they dry out the grapes. And this is very typical to Italy from air drying. So for example, in France, oftentimes sweet wines are done from noble rot or botrytis, where they leave the grapes out and then this rot comes in and sucks out some of the water. And then the concentration of sugar and phenolic compounds goes up compared to the amount of liquid in the grape. And so it's much more intense and rich. Or ice vine, where the frost does the same thing, where they pierce the grapes and some of the water escapes. So Italy tends to do a passito, non-botrytized model. Not always, but generally. So those kind of cover the basics of Italian wines. At this point, I'll just briefly mention some examples if we're okay on time. So as you saw, I didn't really specifically talk about too many wines, but just to show some examples of different wines that you can get. Oh, good question. Speaking of ice wine, is ice wine typical in Italy compared to, say, Germany or Switzerland? And the answer is not really. There aren't too many examples. There's a lot of different other paths to sweet wines in Italy that people use, sometimes genetic, sometimes drying out, sometimes using bacteria to get there, but not so much ice wines. So that's a good question. I'm not familiar any off the top of my head, even though there's some very cool regions of Italy, like in Germany and in Switzerland. Good question. I'll research that. Thank you. So just to give you some examples that I think more to kind of bring everything together. So obviously, some people mentioned Chianti as their favorite wines. So there's a lot of information here, so I'm not going to go over everything. But basically, Chianti is a Sangiovese based grape from central Italy, in Tuscany in this case, in Toscana. And there actually is an area called Chianti, and it's the first area in the world that was recognized as a separate area specific to a style of wine. And so we actually have documents that go back to the 1400s. Our company actually works with Mazzei, which started in 1436 and is the first company to use Chianti in reference to wine. So we have 600 years of history in Chianti as a separate zone. And this usually makes this sour, dark cherry wine with some elegance and smoothness. There's different subzones, including Chianti Classico. There's Colli Aretini, Colli Fiorentini from Firenze, there's Colline Pisane from Pisa, Colli Senesi from Siena. So you can kind of get where I'm going with here is that every area around the original Chianti area felt that they had a version of the wine that was different and unique and special, and they felt was better, maybe, probably. But they all follow similar rules, but they're actually a little bit different. Because they have different climates, different soils, the rules for making Chianti in these different subzones is different. The minimum alcohol, the exact recipe for the grapes, and the aging and so on is a little bit different in the Chianti subzones. And now you start to understand why there's so much complexity in Italian wines, because Italians think about both where it's from and the grape in minute detail. That's a great question. I'll get to that towards the end. That's a very good question. Another one you'll see quite a bit is Chianti Classico Riserva. So once again, now you know, if you didn't before, that it's an extra year of aging. So 24 months minimum for Chianti Classico Riserva compared to Chianti Classico. You may also see out there Chianti Classico Gran Selezione. This is a fairly new concept to Italy. The idea is doing another level above. And in this case, specific wineries are selected to put forth their best single vineyard wine. So you'll see some Gran Selezione wines out there. And those are self-reported best wines from each winery. You may know some other wines from the area, and some of them were mentioned before. So we got Brunello di Montalcino, you got Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, you got Suvereto, you got Morellino di Scanzano. And the easiest way to think about this is that they're all essentially Chianti. Now, I know that's going to sound upsetting to some people, but in the same way that Chianti Classico is different from the different Chianti subzones, where they use slightly different rules, the different areas around, even further away, are mostly using Sangiovese. They're aging it very similarly to Chianti. Sometimes they use different clones of Sangiovese. So in Brunello di Montalcino, you're using Sangiovese Grosso clone, or in Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, you're using Prugnolo Gentile. Or you're using different clones, or you're allowing a little bit more Cabernet Sauvignon. But essentially, the easiest way to begin understanding Toscana wines are these Sangiovese-based wines that are different reflections of Chianti. I don't say that in a good way or a bad way. It's just an easier way to understand the uniqueness and differences between the different red wines in Toscana. And there are others as well, but that covers a lot of the different wines from Toscana. Another good example of why this system comes into place is Barolo versus Barbaresco. Now, Barolo and Barbaresco are 10 miles apart as the crow flies. They use the exact same grapes, Nebbiolo, the same exact clones by law, Michette and Lampia. And yet these are considered different DOCG wines. And in fact, they are different. The geology in the two different areas on average creates grapes in Barolo that are more tannic and are stronger and more powerful, and therefore need to age for an extra year. Just this page alone could be an hour or plus of discussion. So you don't have to look at this entire page, but you can notice some of the similarities and differences that make these incredibly different wines with some similarities just 10 miles apart. And not only that, if you look at the little area of Barolo there, I didn't include this map, and this is for future discussion as well. Just the area of Barolo is made up of 171 subzones. So there's geologically different strata and interspersion of strata and soil types in just this tiny area of Barolo. And that's like a 30 square mile area in Barolo has 171 subtypes. So that's just to give you an idea of how much you can drill down with Italian wines. Another example that I get a lot of question is Amarone. Amarone della Valpolicella, DOCG. How is it different from Valpolicella? Somebody mentioned they love the way it slides off the tongue. Excellent, I agree. Versus Ripasso. So not to give you the full details, but just to give you an idea, once again, a little idea of what Italian wines are like. You have all these wines that I mentioned that use the same grapes, Corvina or Corvinone, with Rondinella. And then some other grapes, maybe Molinara, but that's kind of fallen out of flavor. They're all from the Veneto region. They're all from Valpolicella, which is Greek for the valley, Val, of many Policella, cellars. This was an area that back in the Roman time already had lots of wineries because the wines are so good from this region. So Valpolicella is made as a fresh wine in the very cool northern Veneto region of Italy that is just very pleasant. It's a great summer or lunchtime or beginning of a lighter red wine that's got this brilliant freshness to it, and it's a lovely wine. To get to a bolder style of wine, it's very difficult if you don't have a grape like Nebbiolo. So while there is a rare grape called Ossoleta that you can make some powerful wines, the majority of the grapes in the region don't have this level of tannin. So one thing you can do is you can borrow a sweet wine technique and dry out the grapes. So Amarone is actually an example of Passito. So you see the racks here. These are grapes that are dried on the racks at least for several months. So by law, at least till December 1st, but usually till January, February. And the unique winds, once again, of this region make sure there's no noble rot. There's no mold that forms on these grapes. They stay fresh. But when you press them, you get the same thing where you get this concentration of flavors and tannin and structure. And so it makes this really bold 15, 16, 70% alcohol wine called Amarone from the same exact grapes. And then there was a need for an intermediary wine. So the idea, the concept by the Masi family of introducing a wine called Ripasso, where you take Valpolicella, very basically, not exactly, but very basically, taking Valpolicella wine, pouring it over the physical remnants of Amarone production and drawing from it much more than you would from a normal wine. Yes, that's a good question as well. I'll talk about that now. A lot of people don't know, even a lot of seasoned wine drinkers, that red wines come from red grapes, but white wines can come from either white grapes or red grapes. So what colors the wine is what's on the outside of the skin. So when you press the grapes, the outside of the skin is now touching the juice, which is where the pigment comes from, and a lot of other things. So yeah, that's a good point to throw in there. And the last one, as a kind of an example to talk about, is Prosecco. Prosecco actually is so popular, along with Pinot Grigio, another favorite wine that was mentioned, changed the dynamic of Italy in the last 10 years. So for the majority of Italy's history, Italy was a red wine dominant country. Now we make more white wine in Italy than we do red wine because of these two phenomenal commercial brilliances. And so to answer another question, does Italy protect names in as much as, say, Champagne in France? Absolutely. And Prosecco is a good example of that. So there's no Prosecco grape, not anymore. So the grape that's used to make Prosecco is called Glera. And what happened was this wine became very popular and people tried to do it all over the world. And Italy realized the need to, once again, protect the patrimony of its local areas and to put some structure and protections in it. So now it is a delimited zone, Prosecco di origine controllata, and then even more, there's up to the level of Conegliano, Valdobbiadene, Prosecco di OCG, or the very crazy Cartizze, which is a subzone, and the most expensive grape land in Italy, which is pretty crazy that the most expensive grapes come from Prosecco in this small little area, because Prosecco's become so popular. Not Barolo, for example, which is a couple $1 million for hectare. So a lot of people don't know another fun fact about Prosecco is that in Italy, it's often consumed as a still or a fizzy wine. But for export, we're usually talking about sparkling. So any of those can be labeled as Prosecco, but they're this crisp, refreshing style of celebration wine. Let me see what other questions I didn't get to. I think that was all of them. So that's kind of, I just wanted to go over where Italy is in the world landscape. So in a lot of respects, it's number one, whether it is to you or not. That's your own personal choice, which is the beauty of wines in general, is that you can pick what makes sense to you and what you love. But for a lot of reasons, objectively, Italy has a lot to offer. And whether you love that bounty, that diversity, that opportunity to drink something different every day of the year, Italy can do that unlike any other country, and does it well, in my estimation. And so we kind of understood, hopefully today, a little bit better why Italy has so much to offer and why it makes sense that Italy has so much to offer, and a little bit of the ground rules to make things have some order to them. So that is the presentation. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask me now. If not, this is my email. And Nancy can also is welcome to send this out as well. There was a question about doing this in a more localized format. I'm absolutely happy to help educate any group as well. So definitely feel free to reach out to me. Email is the easiest way, since I do have a 6-month-old. Sometimes I can't answer the phone. So yeah, definitely let me know. But yeah, if you have any questions now, if anything was hard to hear, or I spoke too quickly, or you didn't understand, now's a great time to ask if you have any questions. And then I'll have one last slide.
Yeah, thank you, Stefano, for educating us. That was extremely informative, and I think we're all just waiting for either noon or 5 o'clock or something. So thank you so much for joining us. And if anybody does have any questions, feel free to ask Stefano now, or again, you can contact him directly. Also to note that, again, we are putting together a virtual wine tasting, which Stefano will pick out. I think we're going to choose 2 wines, and we'll have them accessible at the wine shop here in Bird Rock. What's the name of it, Stefano?
Bird Rock Fine Wine. So there's a gentleman named Ken there, is a fantastic guy who's willing to help us out and bring in wines specifically for this group, exclusively for this group. It'll probably be about $35. We're going to be tasting the oldest family winery in Italy. They go back from 1065, so they're almost 1,000 years old. And they make they specialize in 2 varietals, and Primitivo is that. So we'll look at 2 different types of Primitivo and why it's the same and different from Zinfandel. Rosato. Linda had a question about Rosato. Let me get out of presentation mode here. What's your question about Rosato? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
There's a few more questions on there. I think Maureen asked one before Linda, so just if you could go through those 2, that would be great.
So yeah, so Maureen asked the question between fizzy and sparkling wine. So it actually gets, it's a technical difference. It's a specific word. Fizzy is any wine that has sparkle in it up to 3.5 atmospheres of pressure. Usually there aren't too many that go much beyond there, but it's just a lightly sparkling wine. And oftentimes that is done by, so I don't know how many of you know how sparkling wines are made, but oftentimes when we think about full sparkling wines, they're either done in a full tank or the champagne method or the metodo classico method, where you produce bubbles within each bottle itself. For frizzante wines, they're done in the tank method. And the idea is you get to a certain level of little fizz, and then you stop the fermentation. So for example, Moscato di Asti by law can't have more than 6.5% alcohol. So you're fermenting the grapes, and then once you get to a level you want, you chill it down to 0 degrees, and you stop the fermentation, you filter out the yeast, and so you're left with this pleasant little bubble, which is very pleasant for some sweet and dry wines. For full sparkle, you're letting this process happen much longer in the tank till all the sugar, most of the sugar, is eaten by the yeast and turned into alcohol and CO2 and other things, sulfites, for example, and you're letting it have a much higher level of pressure that is dissolved into the liquid. And so it's a specific technical term between the two. So fizzy is frizzante, lightly sparkling, and then spumante has a specific term, where there's a minimum threshold of sparkle you have in the wine. Another question is Italian rosato. Is rosato fairly new in Italian wines? That's a good question. Obviously, when we think about rosés, we think about France. But Italy has a long history of making quite a few different colors. In fact, even before rosato, there were orange wines. So orange wines is taking a white wine and making it go through a red wine process. So you're leaving it on the skins a little bit longer than you normally would with a grape that is white skinned. So you'll actually get this orange color to it, but it'll have more than that. It'll have some of the textures and complexity you usually associate with red wines. And this is actually either Northeastern Italian or even a Georgian technique, where they used to do wines in a slightly oxygen richer environment in clay, amphoras that were buried underground. So yes, different colors of wine, including rosés, have been common to different parts of Italy. The most famous are probably the rosés from Franciacorta, which are some champagne-like wines from the Lombardia region near Milan, which is competitive to champagne as far as sparkling wines. Or also in the southeast and east of Italy, in Abruzzo and in Puglia, they've been making rosés for a very long time as well, to have regions that really focus on red wines, but to have some wines that are a little bit lighter and fresher, like a white wine. The level of grapes in some parts of Italy for white grapes aren't as good as the red grapes, so they make lovely rosés to kind of fill that gap for them. And some lovely examples of rosés. But rosés are done everywhere. Toscana has some very famous rosés. Piemonte even has some nice rosés. And there's one that I drank yesterday that was a combination of Nebbiolo, Dolcetto, and Barbera, which made a much drier, more serious rosé, but still had that lightness of being that we like from rosés. Good questions. Any other questions I can answer for anybody?
I think that was all, but again, if anyone has any additional questions, I'm happy to send you Stefano's contact information, and we really hope that you can join us for the virtual wine tasting. Again, it'll be about 2 wines. We understand that we don't want to open up 6 bottles of wine for you at home. You know,
if you want to, we can do that as well, but we'll start with 2 bottles.
We'll start with 2. And yes, we'll send you the information for that event. Hope you can all join us. And any additional questions, again, feel free to email us. And thank you for joining us for Wednesday Connect. We hope to see you next week. And for all of our other programming, visit our website, ljcommunitycenter.org.
I really appreciate everybody's time. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for having me in your homes. Be safe, be well, and enjoy some wine.